Hi, scholars. Part two of the Where the Red Fern Grows. Uh, we last left everybody. There had just been a fight between Little Ann, Old Dan, and a mountain lion, and they killed him. So let's continue on. If I could find my place. My numb brain started working. I thought of another time the axe had been covered with blood. I don't know why I thought of Reuben Pritchard at that time, or why I thought of the words I had often heard, "There is a little good in all evil." I got to my feet and went over to my dogs. I knew I had to inspect them to see how badly they were hurt. It wasn't too hard to get little Ann to loosen her hold. I examined her body. She was cut in several places, but nothing fatal. The only bad wound she had was in her shoulder. It was 9 inches long and down to the clean white bone. She started licking it immediately. It was different with old Dan. Try as he might, he couldn't turn loose. Maybe could remember the night in the cave when he was a pup, how the big cat had screamed and how he had bawled back at him. I took hold of his hind legs and tried to put him loose. It was no use. He knew that the hold he had was a deadly one, and he wasn't going to let go. I tried to tell him it was all over, and the lion was dead, to turn loose as I wanted to see how badly he was hurt. He couldn't understand, and wouldn't even open his eyes. He was determined to hold on until the body turned cold and stiff. With my axe handle I pried apart his locked jaws. Holding on to his collar, I led him off to one side. I couldn't turn him loose, as I knew if I did he would go back to the lion. With one hand I started examining him. I ran my fingers through the short red hair. I could feel the quivering muscles and the hot, sweaty skin. He was a bloody mess. His long, velvety ears were shredded. His entire body was a mass of deep, raw, red wounds. On both sides of his rib cage the sharp claws had laid the flesh open to the bone. His friendly old face was pitiful to see. A razor-sharp claw had ripped down on an angle across his right eye. It was swollen shut. I wondered if he would ever see from that eye again. Blood dripped from his wounds and fell onto the white oak leaves. I saw he was bleeding to death. With tears running down my cheeks, I did the only thing a hunter could do. I raked the leaves away and let his blood drip on the black mountain soil, mixing it into a mud. I worked it into his wounds to stop the flow of blood. With an axe in one hand and holding onto his collar with the other, we climbed out of the canyon. I knew if I could get him far enough away from the lion he wouldn't go back. On reaching the top, I saw the yellow glow of my lantern. I turned old Dan loose and walked over and picked it up. Not knowing exactly where I was, I looked down out of the mountains to get my bearings. Beyond the foothills and fields I could see the long, white, crooked line of steam marking the river's course. Following the snake-like patterns with my eyes, in no time I knew exactly where I was, for I knew every bend in the river. Anxious to get home so I could take care of my dogs, I turned to call to them. Little Ann was close by. She was sitting down looking at the wound in her shoulder. I saw the shadowy form of old Dan sniffing around the tree where the lion had been treed. As I stood and watched him in the moonlight, my heart swelled with pride. Wounded though he was, he wanted to make sure there was no more lions around. I called to him. In a stiff-legged trot he came to me. I caught hold of his collar and gave him another inspection. In the lantern light I could see the mud-caked wounds clearly. Bleeding had almost stopped. I felt much better. Little Ann came over. I knelt down and put my arms around them. I knew that if it hadn't been for their loyal and unselfish courage, I could have probably been killed by slashing the claws of the devil cat. "I don't know how I'll ever pay you back for what you've done," I said, "but I'll never forget it." Getting up, I said, "Come on, let's go home so I can take care of those wounds." I hadn't gone far when I heard a cry. As at first I thought it was a bird or a nighthawk, I stood still and listened. I glanced at little Ann. She was looking behind me. I turned around and looked for old Dan. He was nowhere in sight. The cry came again, low and pitiful, and instantly little Ann started back the way we had come. I followed as fast as I could run. I found old Dan lying on his side, pleading for help. What I saw was almost more than I could stand. There, tangled in the low branches of a huckleberry bush, was the entrails of my dog. With a gasping cry I knelt down by his side. I knew what had happened. Far back in the soft belly, the slashing razor-sharp claws of the lion had cut into the hollow In my inspections, I'd overlooked the wound. His entrails had worked out and had become entangled in the bush. The forward motion of his body had done the rest. He whimpered as I laid my hand on his head. A warm, red tongue flicked out at it. With tears in my eyes, I started talking to him. "Hang on, boy," I said. "Everything will be all right. I'll take care of you." With trembling hands I unwound the entrails from the bush. With my handkerchief I wiped away the gravel, leaves, and pine needles. With fingers that shook I worked the entrails back in the wound. Knowing that I couldn't carry him, and that the axe and lantern, I stuck the axe deep in the side of the white oak. I blew out the lantern and hung the handle over the other blade. I wrapped my dog in my old sheepskin coat and hurried for home. Arriving home, I awakened my mother and father. Together we doctored my dogs. Old Dan was taken care of first. Very gently, Mamma worked the entrails out in a pan of warm soapy water and washed them clean of pine needles, leaves, and grit. "If only I knew what I was doing," Mamma said as she worked, "I'd feel better." With gentle hands she worked the entrails back through the opening. The wound was sewn up and bandaged with a clean white cloth. Little Ann wasn't hard to doctor. I held her head while Mamma cleaned her wounds with peroxide. Feeling the bite of the strong liquid, she whined and licked at my hands. "It's all right, little girl," I said. "You'll be well in no time." I opened the door and watched her as she limped off to the doghouse. Hearing a whimper, I turned around. There in the door to the room stood my sisters. I could tell by the looks on their faces that they had been watching for some time. They looked pitiful standing there in their long white gowns. I felt sorry for them. "Will little Ann be all right?" my oldest sister asked. "Yes," I said. "She'll be all right. She only had one bad wound, and we've taken care of that." "Old Dan's hurt bad, isn't he?" she said. I nodded my head. "How bad is it?" she asked. "It's bad," I said. "He was cut wide open." They all started crying. "Now here," Mamma said, going over, "you girls get back in bed. You'll take a death of cold, being up like this in your bare feet." "Mommy," the little one said, "God won't let old Dan die, will he?" "I don't think so, honey," Mamma said. "Now off to bed." They turned and walked slowly back to their room. "The way your dogs are cut up," Papa said, "it must have been a terrible fight." "It was, Papa," I said. "I never saw anything like it. Little Ann wouldn't have fought the lion if it hadn't been for old Dan. All she was doing was helping him. He wouldn't quit. He just stayed right in there till the end. I even had to pry his jaws loose from the lion's throat after the lion was dead." Glancing at old Dan, Papa said, "It's in his blood, Billy. He's a hunting hound, and the best one I ever saw. He only has two loves, you and hunting. That's all he knows." "If it hadn't been for them, Papa," I said, "I probably wouldn't be here now." "What do you mean?" Mama said. "You wouldn't be here now." I told him how the lion had leaped at me and how my dogs had gotten between him and me. "They were so close together," I said. "When they came up off the ground they looked just like one." There was a moaning sigh from Mama. She covered her face with her hands and started crying. "I don't know," she said. "I just don't know. To think how close you came to being killed. I don't think I can stand any more." Now, Papa said as he walked over and put his arms around her. "Don't go all to pieces. It's all over. Let's be thankful and do our best for old Dan." "Do you think he'll die, Papa?" I asked. "I don't know, Billy," Papa said, shaking his head. "He's lost an awful lot of blood and he's a mighty sick dog. All we can do now is wait." Our wait wasn't long. My dog's breathing grew faster and faster, and there was a terrible rattling in his throat. I knelt down and laid his head in my lap. Old Dan must have known he was dying. Just before he drew one last sigh, and a feeble thump of his tail, his friendly gray eyes closed forever. At first I couldn't believe my dog was dead. I started talking to him. "Please don't die, Dan," I said. "Don't leave me now." I looked to Mama for help. Her face was as white as a bark on a sycamore tree, and the hurt in her eyes tore at my heart. She opened her mouth to say something, but words wouldn't come out. Feeling as cold as an Arctic wind, I stood up and stumbled to a chair. Mama came over and said something. Her words were only a murmur in my ears. Very gently, Papa picked old Dan up in his arms and carried him out on the porch. When he came back to the house, he said, "Well, we did all we could do, but I guess it wasn't enough." Okay, that's a rough one, guys. But we will continue this on the next one. Hopefully, these videos will get a little bit longer in the future, so I don't have to worry about the time so much, okay? Take care.